The City of London is at its most vulnerable at 5:47 a.m. The streets are empty, the sky is dark, and the millions of people who power the capital are still deep in slumber. But on December 14, 2016, the silence of a quiet residential street in Banstead was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a battering ram. This was Operation Archway, a code red maneuver involving over 200 officers from the National Crime Agency and the Metropolitan Police. Their target wasn't a violent extremist or a bank robber. It was a man named Joyce Senghore-Arias. As the officers surged into the hallway and escorted the bewildered 41-year-old from his home in handcuffs, his neighbors had no idea they were watching the downfall of one of the most significant insider threats in British aviation history. Just 12 hours prior to this raid, Joyce had walked through the employee security checkpoints at Heathrow Terminal 5 with the confidence of a man who owned the building. To the thousands of tired travelers waiting for their luggage, he was invisible, just another worker in a high-visibility vest, moving bags from tarmac to terminal. But beneath that mundane exterior lay a secret that had compromised the safety of the entire airport. While families were worrying about lost souvenirs or delayed strollers, Joyce was orchestrating a disappearing act worth £16 million. For 15 months, he had not merely handled baggage. He had transformed the trusted infrastructure of Heathrow into a high-speed logistical pipeline for organized crime. To understand the sheer audacity of what Joyce did, you have to understand the security theater we all participate in. When you fly internationally, say from Brazil to London, you expect a certain ritual. You land, you go through passport control, and you collect your bag. Then, you make that nervous walk through customs, choosing between the green channel for nothing to declare or the red channel. We assume that line of defense is solid. But Joyce discovered a flaw in the architecture, so simple, yet so devastating, that it rendered customs completely obsolete. He realized that the choice between the green and red channels doesn't matter if your bag never enters the hall in the first place. Here is the mechanics of the perfect breach. Joyce, alongside his colleague Mohammed Ali, would identify specific suitcases arriving on flights from South America, luggage packed not with clothes but with high-purity illicit substances. In a normal world, these bags would travel to the international carousel, where customs officers and sniffer dogs were waiting. But Joyce intervened before that could happen. Using his insider access, he would intercept these specific bags and divert them. Instead of heading to the international hall, the bags were rerouted to the domestic arrivals carousel. This was the stroke of genius that terrified investigators. At the same time the international flight landed, a courier would arrive on a domestic flight from a city like Manchester or Edinburgh. Domestic passengers don't go through customs because they haven't left the country. This courier would receive a text message containing a photograph of a specific suitcase, perhaps a blue Samsonite with a distinct ribbon. They would walk to the domestic carousel, pick up a bag that had just arrived from Brazil, and walk out of the airport into the London morning without ever seeing a customs officer. It was a magic trick performed with industrial conveyor belts, turning the airport's own efficiency against itself. While the mechanics of the baggage swap were technically brilliant, the true engine of this operation wasn't conveyor belts or security loopholes. It was something far more primal and difficult to dismantle: shared lineage. In the world of high-stakes criminal logistics, trust is the most expensive commodity. You can bribe a stranger, but you can never be certain they won't reveal your secrets to the highest bidder. But family provides a layer of silence that money simply cannot buy. Joyce Senghore-Arias wasn't operating in a vacuum. The architect standing in the shadows, the man connecting the insider access to the global supply chain, was his own brother-in-law, Preet Monga. This wasn't merely a partnership, it was a domestic alliance. When Monga approached Joyce, he wasn't just offering a business proposition, he was leveraging decades of shared history. The psychology here is devastatingly effective. When a relative asks for a favor, even an illegal one, the pressure to comply is entangled with loyalty, obligation, and the fear of severing personal ties. By keeping the core of the operation within the family unit, They created a fortress of silence that baffled investigators for months. It was a closed loop where the professional and the personal were dangerously indistinguishable. However, a two-man team couldn't move £16 million of product alone. The corruption had to spread, and it found a willing host in Muhammad Ali, a 41-year-old colleague of Joyce's at British Airways. Ali wasn't just another pair of hands. He was the second set of eyes, doubling the network's capacity to monitor the baggage flow. Between Joyce and Ali, the organization had effectively blinded the airport's internal monitoring systems at Terminal 5. They created a blind spot in one of the most surveilled buildings on Earth, allowing them to cherry-pick luggage at will. But perhaps the most disturbing element of this network was the foot soldiers they recruited to finish the job. The brilliance of the scheme relied on the couriers looking utterly forgettable. The organizers, including men like Wilfred Owusu and Michael Sutherland, understood that a seasoned career criminal draws attention. They needed people who looked like you. They targeted individuals like Moses Awuku and Felicia Kufa, ordinary citizens, often in financial distress, who could be manipulated into taking what seemed like a low-risk gamble. The pitch was seductive in its simplicity. Take a domestic flight, pick up a suitcase and walk out. Easy money. The psychological genius lay in the plausible deniability baked into the task. If a courier was stopped with the wrong bag, they had a ready-made script. Sorry, I must have grabbed the wrong blue Samsonite. I just flew in from Manchester. It is a mistake that happens thousands of times a day in airports worldwide. By using this cover, the network turned the mundane confusion of travel into a shield for international trafficking. These couriers were not just mules. They were actors in a carefully choreographed play, unknowing pawns in a game where the stakes were their own freedom. They walked through the arrivals hall, gripping handles of suitcases that contained enough illicit material to result in decades of incarceration, shielded only by the arrogance of a plan that assumed the authorities were not watching. But the authorities were watching, and the silence of the family bond was about to be tested against the crushing weight of the law. For 15 months, the syndicate operated under the comforting delusion that their method was undetectable. They believed that by bypassing the physical checkpoint of customs, they had bypassed the attention of the authorities entirely. While Joyce Senghore-Arias was diverting luggage and Preet Monga was counting the proceeds, a quiet storm was gathering in the offices of the National Crime Agency, NCA. This was Operation Archway, and the investigators weren't just watching. They were listening to every breath the network took. The breakthrough didn't come from a physical slip-up at the airport, but from the invisible digital trails that modern criminals cannot help but leave behind. The NCA had tapped the communication lines, turning the syndicate's greatest asset, their coordination, into their greatest liability. What the audio intercepts revealed changed the scope of the investigation entirely. The agents realized they weren't tracking a loose collection of corrupt staff trying to make extra cash. They were monitoring a sophisticated international logistics firm that just happened to trade in illicit cargo. The call logs painted a picture of staggering global reach. There was a constant, rhythmic pulse of communication between UK numbers and unlisted phones in Brazil, specifically Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. These weren't vague check-ins. They were precise, scheduled logistical meetings. The Brazilian suppliers had turned airport corruption into a franchise model. They weren't just shipping product and hoping for the best. They were selecting specific flights weeks in advance, based on roster schedules provided by the insiders at Heathrow. They knew exactly who was working, which carousel offered the best sightlines, and precisely when the shift changes occurred. As the surveillance dragged on, the scale of the enterprise began to keep the investigators awake at night. The data suggested that this single cell had moved over £16 million worth of high-grade narcotics through Terminal 5 in just over a year. But it was the efficiency that was truly chilling. This wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a steady, reliable flow of contraband that had turned the airport's luggage system into a private delivery service. The syndicate had operated with such impunity that they had begun to treat the airport authorities with a kind of silent mockery, moving millions right under the noses of the border force. the tension within the investigation room grew with every intercepted call. The agents faced a classic dilemma: strike now and take down the foot soldiers, or wait and risk letting more illicit material flood the streets in hopes of catching the kingpins. The tipping point came as the intelligence began to suggest that this method wasn't unique to London. The carousel switch was a structural vulnerability that could be replicated in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Madrid, or Paris. The Brazilian network had essentially open-sourced the code for airport breaches. By December 14, 2016, the decision was made. They couldn't wait any longer. The evidence was overwhelming, the key players were identified, and the risk of the network expanding further was too high. The NCA, in coordination with the Metropolitan Police and Border Force, prepared to execute the final phase of the operation. As the clock ticked toward 5:47 a.m., the surveillance teams confirmed that the targets were in their homes, asleep, unaware that the 15 months of silence were about to end with a deafening crash. The invisible watch was over. It was time for the intervention. The silence of the baggage hall was replaced by the hushed tension of the courtroom. As the trials began at Kingston and Southwark Crown Courts, the full scope of the betrayal was laid bare for the jury. But it was in the sentencing phase that the British justice system sent a message that reverberated far beyond the legal community and straight into the boardrooms of global aviation. The sentences handed down were not merely punishments for trafficking illicit substances, they were a severe condemnation of the corruption of critical national infrastructure. The psychology of the courtroom drama offered a final, bitter twist. Joyce Senghore-Arias, the man who had facilitated the breach, chose to plead guilty. He admitted his role, perhaps hoping that his cooperation would buy him leniency. His colleague, Muhammad Ali, took the opposite gamble, maintaining his innocence and fighting the charges until the bitter end. The result was a stark lesson in the severity of the crime. Joyce received 16 years. Ali received 15. The man who confessed received a longer sentence than the man who fought. The message was unequivocal: when you hold the keys to the kingdom, and you open the door for criminals, no amount of apology can mitigate the damage. The breach of trust was considered so absolute that it outweighed the utility of a confession. The ringleaders, Wilfred Owusu and Michael Sutherland, were each handed 20-year sentences. In total, the network received a combined 139 years in custody. It was a staggering figure for a group that had operated for only 15 months. The judge's rationale was clear. This was not just about narcotics. By compromising the secure zone of an international airport, they had created a vulnerability that could have been exploited for terrorism or espionage. They had turned the safety of millions of passengers into a commodity. In the wake of Operation Archway, Heathrow Airport scrambled to close the loophole. New tracking systems were installed, employee vetting was intensified, and the domestic carousel vulnerability became a case study for security chiefs worldwide. But if you think this story ends with the prison doors slamming shut, you are mistaken. The criminal underworld is resilient. When one door closes, they simply carve a new one. Just months after these heavy sentences were handed down, the resilience of the Brazilian supply chain was proven in almost comical, yet terrifying, fashion. Border Force officers intercepted a traveler named Jaime Choi arriving from South America. He wasn't using a corrupt baggage handler, but the attempt proved the route was still active. Inside his luggage, hidden within hollowed-out wheels of Parmesan cheese, was yet another shipment of high-purity cocaine. The method had shifted from complex insider corruption to concealment, but the destination remained the same. The suppliers had not been deterred by the 139 years of prison time. They had simply recalculated the risk. This leaves us with a chilling realization as we stand in the airport terminals of 2025. The systemic flaw that Joyce Senghore-Arias exploited wasn't really about baggage belts or architecture. It was about people. You can upgrade the scanners, you can add more cameras, and you can build higher walls. But you cannot engineer a patch for human greed or family loyalty. As long as there are people working inside the secure zones who need money, or who have brother-in-laws with criminal connections, the vulnerability remains. The next time you are standing at the carousel, watching the bags circle endlessly, remember this story. The person handling your luggage is the unseen guardian of your safety. Most are honest, hard-working professionals, but somewhere in the complex machinery of global travel, there is always someone looking for a loophole, someone calculating the price of a blind eye. The Heathrow Ghost Protocol was dismantled, but the motivation that built it is eternal. We are only safe until the next Joyce finds a new way to turn the system against us. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never assume that the systems designed to protect you are impenetrable.